This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 37. Liberty. No matter with what solemnities he may have been devoted upon the altar of slavery, the moment he touches the sacred soil of Britain, the altar and the gods sink together in the dust, and he stands redeemed, regenerated, and disenthralled by the irresistible genius of universal emancipation. Curran. Note: John Philpot Curran, 1750-1817, Irish orator and judge who worked for Catholic emancipation. A while we must leave Tom in the hands of his persecutors, while we turn to pursue the fortunes of George and his wife, whom we left in friendly hands in a farmhouse on the roadside. Tom Locker we left groaning and tousling in a most immaculately clean Quaker bed under the motherly supervision of Aunt Dorcas, who found him to the full as tractable a patient as a sick bison. Imagine a tall, dignified, spiritual woman whose clear muslin cap shades waves of silvery hair, parted on a broad, clear forehead, which overarches thoughtful gray eyes. A snowy handkerchief of lissé crape is folded neatly across her bosom. Her glossy brown silk dress rustles peacefully as she glides up and down the chamber. "The devil!" says Tom Locker, giving a great throw to the bedclothes.
"I must request thee, Thomas, not to use such language," says Aunt Dorcas, as she quietly rearranged the bed.
"Well, I won't, Granny, if I can help it," says Tom. "But it is enough to make a fellow swear so cursedly hot."
Dorcas removed a comforter from the bed, straightened the clothes again, and tucked them in till Tom looked something like a chrysalis, remarking as she did so,
"I wish, friend, thee would leave off cursing and swearing, and think upon thy ways."
"What the devil," said Tom, "should I think of them for? Last thing ever I want to think of, hang it all."
And Tom flounced over, untucking and disarranging everything in a manner frightful to behold.
"That fellow and gal are here, I suppose," said he, sullenly, after a pause.
"They are so," said Dorcas.
"They'd better be off up to the lake," said Tom. "The quicker the better."
"Probably they will do so," said Aunt Dorcas, knitting peacefully.
"And harkye," said Tom, "we've got correspondents in Sandusky that watch the boats for us. I don't care if I tell now. I hope they will get away, just to spite Marks, the cursed puppy. Damn him!"
"Thomas," said Dorcas.
"I tell you, Granny, if you bottle a fellow up too tight, I shall split," said Tom. "But about the gal, tell 'em to dress her up some way so's to alter her. Her description's out in Sandusky."
"We will attend to that matter," said Dorcas, with characteristic composure. As we at this place take leave of Tom Locker, we may as well say that, having lain 3 weeks at the Quaker dwelling, sick with a rheumatic fever, which set in company with his other afflictions, Tom arose from his bed a somewhat sadder and wiser man, and, in place of slave-catching, betook himself to life in one of the new settlements, where his talents developed themselves more happily in trapping bears, wolves, and other inhabitants of the forest, in which he made himself quite a name in the land. Tom always spoke reverently of the Quakers.
"Nice people," he would say. "Wanted to convert me, but couldn't come it exactly. But tell you what, stranger, they do fix up a sick fellow first rate, no mistake. Make just the tallest kind of broth and knickknacks."
As Tom had informed them that their party would be looked for in Sandusky, it was thought prudent to divide them. Jim, with his old mother, was forwarded separately, and a night or two after, George and Eliza, with their child, were driven privately into Sandusky, and lodged beneath the hospital roof, preparatory to taking their last passage on the lake. Their night was now far spent, and the morning star of liberty rose fair before them. Electric word! What is it? Is there anything more in it than a name, a rhetorical flourish? Why, men and women of America, does your heart's blood thrill at that word, for which your fathers bled, and your braver mothers were willing that their noblest and best should die? Is there anything in it glorious and dear for a nation that is not also glorious and dear for a man? What is freedom to a nation but freedom to the individuals in it? What is freedom to that young man who sits there with his arms folded over his broad chest, the tint of African blood in his cheek, its dark fires in his eyes? What is freedom to George Harris, To your fathers, freedom was the right of a nation to be a nation. To him it is the right of a man to be a man, and not a brute. The right to call the wife of his bosom his wife, and to protect her from lawless violence. The right to protect and educate his child. The right to have a home of his own, a religion of his own, a character of his own, unsubject to the will of another. All these thoughts were rolling and seething in George's breast as he was pensively leaning his head on his hand, watching his wife, as she was adapting to her slender and pretty form the articles of man's attire, in which it was deemed safest she should make her escape. "Now for it," said she, as she stood before the glass and shook down her silky abundance of black curly hair. "I say, George, it's almost a pity, isn't it?" she said, as she held up some of it playfully. "Pity it's all got to come off." George smiled sadly and made no answer. Eliza turned to the glass, and the scissors glittered as one long lock after another was detached from her head. "There, now, that'll do," she said, taking up a hairbrush. "Now for a few fancy touches. There, ain't I a pretty young fellow?" she said, turning around to her husband, laughing and blushing at the same time. "You always will be pretty, do what you will," said George. "What does make you so sober?" said Eliza, kneeling on one knee and laying her hand on his. "We are only within 24 hours of Canada, they say. Only a day and a night on the lake, and then oh, then "Oh, Eliza," said George, drawing her towards him, "that is it. Now my fate is all narrowing down to a point. To come so near, to be almost in sight, and then lose all, I should never live under it, Eliza." "Don't fear," said his wife hopefully. "The good Lord would not have brought us so far if he didn't mean to carry us through. I seem to feel him with us, George." "You are a blessed woman, Eliza," said George, clasping her with a convulsive grasp. "But, oh, tell me, can this great mercy be for us? Will these years and years of misery come to an end? Shall we be free?" "I am sure of it, George," said Eliza, looking upward, while tears of hope and enthusiasm shone on her long dark lashes. "I feel it in me that God is going to bring us out of bondage this very day." "I will believe you, Eliza," said George, rising suddenly up. "I will believe. Come, let's be off." "Well, indeed," said he, holding her off at arm's length and looking admiringly at her. "You are a pretty little fellow. That crop of little short curls is quite becoming. Put on your cap. So, a little to one side. I never saw you look quite so pretty. But it's almost time for the carriage. I wonder if Mrs. Smith has got Harry rigged." The door opened, and a respectable middle-aged woman entered, leading little Harry, dressed in girl's clothes. "What a pretty girl he makes," said Eliza, turning him around. "We call him Harriet, you see. Don't the name come nicely?" The child stood gravely regarding his mother in her new and strange attire, observing a profound silence, and occasionally drawing deep sighs and peeping at her from under his dark curls. "Does Harry know, mamma?" said Eliza, stretching her hands toward him. The child clung shyly to the woman. "Come, Eliza, why do you try to coax him, when you know that he has got to be kept away from you?" "I know it's foolish," said Eliza, "yet I can't bear to have him turn away from me. But come, where's my cloak? Here, how is it men put on cloaks, George?" "You must wear it so," said her husband, throwing it over his shoulders. "So, then," said Eliza, imitating the motion. "And I must stamp, and take long steps, and try to look saucy." "Don't exert yourself," said George. "There is, now and then, a modest young man, and I think it would be easier for you to act that character." "And these gloves, mercy upon us!" said Eliza. "Why, my hands are lost in them." "I advise you to keep them on pretty strictly," said George. "Your slender paw might bring us all out. Now, Mrs. Smith, you are to go under our charge, and be our auntie. You mind?" "I've heard," said Mrs. Smith, "that there have been men down, warning all the packet captains against a man and woman with a little boy." "They have," said George. "Well, if we see any such people, we can tell them." A hack now drove to the door, and the friendly family who had received the fugitives crowded around them with farewell greetings. The disguises the party had assumed were in accordance with the hints of Tom Locker. Mrs. Smith, a respectable woman from the settlement in Canada, whither they were fleeing, being fortunately about crossing the lake to return thither, had consented to appear as the aunt of little Harry, and in order to attach him to her he had been allowed to remain the last 2 days under her sole charge, and an extra amount of petting, jointed to an indefinite amount of seed cakes and candy, had cemented a very close attachment on the part of the young gentleman. The hack drove to the wharf. The 2 young men, as they appeared, walked up the plank into the boat, Eliza gallantly giving her arm to Mrs. Smith, and George attending to their baggage. George was standing at the captain's office, settling for his party, when he overheard 2 men talking by his side.
"I've watched every one that came on board," said one, "and I know they're not on this boat."
The voice was that of the clerk of the boat. The speaker whom he addressed was our sometime friend Marks, who, with that valuable perseverance which characterized him, had come on to Sandusky, seeking whom he might devour.
"You would scarcely know the woman from a white one," said Marks. "The man is a very light mulatto. He has a brand in one of his hands."
The hand with which George was taking the tickets and change trembled a little, but he turned coolly round, fixed an unconcerned glance on the face of the speaker, and walked leisurely toward another part of the boat, where Eliza stood waiting for him. Mrs. Smith, with little Harry, sought the seclusion of the ladies' cabin, where the dark beauty of the supposed little girl drew many flattering comments from the passengers. George had the satisfaction, as the bell rang out its farewell peal, to see Marks walk down the plank to the shore, and drew a long sigh of relief when the boat had put a returnless distance between them. It was a superb day. The blue waves of Lake Erie danced, rippling and sparkling in the sunlight. A fresh breeze blew from the shore, and the lordly boat plowed her way right gallantly onward. Oh, what an untold world there is in one human heart! Who thought, as George walked calmly up and down the deck of the steamer, with his shy companion at his side, of all that was burning in his bosom? The mighty good that seemed approaching seemed too good, too fair, even to be a reality, and he felt a jealous dread, every moment of the day, that something would rise to snatch it from him. But the boat swept on, hours fleeted, and at last clear and full rose the blessed English shores, shores charmed by a mighty swell, with one touch to dissolve every incantation of slavery, no matter in what language pronounced, or by what national power confirmed. George and his wife stood arm in arm as the boat neared the small town of Amherstburg in Canada. His breath grew thick and short. A mist gathered before his eyes. He silently pressed the little hand that lay trembling on his arm. The bell rang. The boat stopped. Scarcely seeing what he did, he looked out his baggage and gathered his little party. The little company were landed on the shore. They stood still till the boat had cleared, and then, with tears and embracings, the husband and wife, with their wondering child in their arms, knelt down and lifted up their hearts to God. 'Twas something like the burst from death to life, from the grave's cerements to the robes of heaven, from sin's dominion and from passion's strife, to the pure freedom of a soul forgiven, where all the bonds of death and hell are riven, and mortal puts on immortality, when mercy's hand hath turned the golden key, and mercy's voice hath said, Rejoice, thy soul is free. The little party were soon guided by Mrs. Smith to the hospitable abode of a good missionary, whom Christian charity has placed here as a shepherd to the outcast and wandering, who are constantly finding an asylum on this shore. Who can speak the blessedness of that first day of freedom? Is not the sense of liberty a higher and a finer one than any of the 5? To move, speak, and breathe, go out and come in unwatched, and free from danger. Who can speak the blessings of that rest which comes down on the free man's pillow, under laws which ensure to him the rights that God has given to man? How fair and precious to that mother was that sleeping child's face, endeared by the memory of 1,000 dangers! How impossible was it to sleep in the exuberant possession of such blessedness! And yet these 2 had not 1 acre of ground, not a roof that they could call their own. They had spent their all to the last dollar. They had nothing more than the birds of the air or the flowers of the field. Yet they could not sleep for joy. Oh, ye who take freedom from man, with what words shall ye answer it to God? End of chapter 37. Vox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 38. The Victory. Thanks be unto God, who giveth us this victory. 1 Corinthians 15:57. Have not many of us in the weary way of life felt in some hours how far easier it were to die than to live? The martyr, when faced even by a death of bodily anguish and horror, finds in the very terror of his doom a strong stimulant and tonic. There is a vivid excitement, a thrill and fervor, which may carry through any crisis of suffering that is the birth hour of eternal glory and rest. But to live, to wear on, day after day, of mean, bitter, low, harassing servitude, every nerve dampened and depressed, every power of feeling gradually smothered, this long and wasting heart-martyrdom, this slow, daily bleeding away of the inward life, drop by drop, hour after hour, this is the true searching test of what there may be in man or woman. When Tom stood face to face with his persecutor, and heard his threats, and thought in his very soul that his hour was come, his heart swelled bravely in him, and he thought he could bear torture and fire, bear anything, with a vision of Jesus and heaven but just a step beyond. But when he was gone, and the present excitement passed off, came back the pain of his bruised and weary limbs, came back the sense of his utterly degraded, hopeless, forlorn estate, and the day passed wearily enough. Long before his wounds were healed, Legree insisted that he should be put to the regular field work, and then came day after day of pain and weariness, aggravated by every kind of injustice and indignity that the ill will of a mean and malicious mind could devise. Whoever in our circumstances has made trial of pain, even with all the alleviations which for us usually attend it, must know the irritation that comes with it. Tom no longer wondered at the habitual surliness of his associates. Nay, he found the placid, sunny temper which had been the habitude of his life broken in on and sorely strained by the inroads of the same thing. He had flattered himself on leisure to read his Bible, but there was no such thing as leisure there. In the height of the season, Legree did not hesitate to press all his hands through, Sundays and weekdays alike. Why shouldn't he? He made more cotton by it, and gained his wager, and if it wore out a few more hands, he could buy better ones. At first Tom used to read a verse or two of his Bible by the flicker of the fire, after he had returned from his daily toil. But after the cruel treatment he received, he used to come home so exhausted that his head swam and his eyes failed when he tried to read, and he was fain to stretch himself down with the others in utter exhaustion. Is it strange that the religious peace and trust which had upborne him hitherto should give way to tossings of soul and despondent darkness? The gloomiest problem of this mysterious life was constantly before his eyes: souls crushed and ruined, evil triumphant, and God silent. It was weeks and months that Tom wrestled in his own soul in darkness and sorrow. He thought of Miss Ophelia's letter to his Kentucky friends, and would pray earnestly that God would send him deliverance, and then he would watch, day after day, in the vague hope of seeing somebody sent to redeem him, and, when nobody came, he would crush back to his soul bitter thoughts that it was vain to serve God, that God had forgotten him. He sometimes saw Cassie, and sometimes, when summoned to the house, caught a glimpse of the dejected form of Emmeline, but held very little communion with either. In fact, there was no time for him to commune with anybody. One evening he was sitting in utter dejection and prostration by a few decaying brands, where his coarse supper was baking. He put a few bits of brushwood on the fire, and strove to raise the light, and then drew his worn Bible from his pocket. There were all the marked pages which had thrilled his soul so often, words of patriarchs and seers, poets and sages, who from early time had spoken courage to man, voices from the great cloud of witnesses who ever surround us in the race of life. Had the word lost its power, or could the failing eye and weary sense no longer answer to the touch of that mighty inspiration? Heavily sighing, he put it in his pocket. A coarse laugh roused him. He looked up. Legree was standing opposite to him.
"Well, old boy," he said, "you find your religion don't work, it seems. I thought I should get that through your wool at last."
The cruel taunt was more than hunger and cold and nakedness. Tom was silent.
"You were a fool," said Legree, "for I meant to do well by you when I bought you. You might have been better off than Sambo or Quimbo either, and had easy times. And instead of getting cut up and thrashed every day or two, you might have had liberty to lord it around and cut up the other niggers. And you might have had, now and then, a good warming of whiskey punch. Come, Tom, don't you think you'd better be reasonable? Heave that our old pack of trash in the fire and join my church."
"The Lord forbid," said Tom fervently.
"You see, the Lord ain't going to help you. If he had been, he wouldn't have let me get you. This here religion is all a mess of lying trumpery, Tom. I know all about it. You'd better hold to me. I'm somebody and can do something."
"No, massa," said Tom. "I'll hold on. The Lord may help me or not help, but I'll hold to him and believe him to the last."
"The more fool you," said Legree, spitting scornfully at him and spurning him with his foot. "Never mind, I'll chase you down yet and bring you under. You'll see."
And Legree turned away. When a heavy weight presses the soul to the lowest level at which endurance is possible, there is an instant and desperate effort of every physical and moral nerve to throw off the weight, and hence the heaviest anguish often precedes a return tide of joy and courage. So was it now with Tom. The atheistic taunts of his cruel master sunk his before dejected soul to the lowest ebb, and though the hand of faith still held to the eternal rock, it was a numb, despairing grasp. Tom sat like one stunned at the fire. Suddenly everything around him seemed to fade, and a vision rose before him of one crowned with thorns, buffeted and bleeding. Tom gazed in awe and wonder at the majestic patience of the face. The deep, pathetic eyes thrilled him to his innermost heart. His soul woke, as, with floods of emotion, he stretched out his hands and fell upon his knees, when gradually the vision changed. The sharp thorns became rays of glory, and in splendor inconceivable he saw that same face bending compassionately towards him, and a voice said, "He that overcometh shall sit down with me on my throne, even as I also overcome, and am set down with my Father on his throne." How long Tom lay there he knew not. When he came to himself the fire was gone out, his clothes were wet with the chill and drenching dews. But the dread soul crisis was past, and in the joy that filled him he no longer felt hunger, cold, degradation, disappointment, wretchedness. From his deepest soul he that hour loosed and parted from every hope in life that now is, and offered his own will and unquestioning sacrifice to the Infinite. Tom looked up to the silent, ever-living stars, types of the angelic hosts who ever look down on man, and the solitude of the night rung with the triumphant words of a hymn which he had sung often in happier days, but never with such feeling as now.
"The earth shall be dissolved like snow, the sun shall cease to shine, but God who called me here below shall be forever mine. And when this mortal life shall fail, and flesh and sense shall cease, I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining like the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun." Those who have been familiar with the religious histories of the slave population know that relations like what we have narrated are very common among them.
We have heard some from their own lips of a very touching and affecting character. The psychologist tells us of a state in which the affections and images of the mind become so dominant and overpowering that they press into their service the outward imagining. Who shall measure what an all-pervading spirit may do with these capabilities of our mortality, or the ways in which he may encourage the desponding souls of the desolate? If the poor forgotten slave believes that Jesus hath appeared and spoken to him, who shall contradict him? Did he not say his mission in all ages was to bind up the broken-hearted and set at liberty them that are bruised? When the dim gray of dawn woke the slumberers to go forth to the field, there was among those tattered and shivering wretches one who walked with an exultant tread, for firmer than the ground he trod on was his strong faith in almighty, eternal love. Ah, Legree, try all your forces now. Utmost agony, woe, degradation, want, and loss of all things shall only hasten on the process by which he shall be made a king and a priest unto God. From this time an inviolable sphere of peace encompassed the lowly heart of the oppressed one. An ever-present Savior hallowed it as a temple. Past now the bleeding of earthly regrets, past its fluctuations of hope and fear and desire. The human will, bent and bleeding and struggling long, was now entirely merged in the divine. So short now seemed the remaining voyage of life, so near, so vivid seemed eternal blessedness, that life's uttermost woes fell from him unharming. All noticed the change in his appearance. Cheerfulness and alertness seemed to return to him, and a quietness which no insult or injury could ruffle seemed to possess him.
"What the devil's got into Tom?" Legree said to Sambo. "A while ago he was all down in the mouth, and now he's pert as a cricket." "Dunno, massa. Gwine to run off, maybe." "Like to see him try that," said Legree with a savage grin. "Wouldn't we, Sambo?"
"Guess we would, ha ha!"
said the sooty gnome, laughing obsequiously.
"Lord, de fun! To see him sticking in the mud, chasing and trying through the brushes, dogs a holding on to him. Lord, I laughed fit to split. Dat time we cotched Molly, I thought they'd a had her all stripped up before I could get 'em off. She carries de marks so dat dar spree yet."
"I reckon she will to her grave," said Legree. "But now, Sambo, you look sharp. If the nigger's got anything of this sort going, trip him up."
"Massa, let me lone for dat," said Sambo. "I'll treat a coon, ho ho ho!"
This was spoken as Legree was getting on his horse to go to the neighboring town. That night, as he was returning, he thought he would turn his horse and ride round the quarters and see if all was safe. It was a superb moonlight night, and the shadows of the graceful china trees lay minutely penciled on the turf below, and there was that transparent stillness in the air which it seems almost unholy to disturb. Legree was a little distance from the quarters when he heard the voice of some one singing. It was not a usual sound there, and he paused to listen. A musical tenor voice sang: "When I can read my title clear to mansions in the skies, I'll bid farewell to every fear, and wipe my weeping eyes. Should earth against my soul engage, and hellish darts be hurled, then I can smile at Satan's rage, and face a frowning world. Let cares like a wild deluge come, and storms of sorrow fall, may I but safely reach my home, my God, my heaven, my all." On My Journey Home, hymn by Isaac Watts, found in many of the southern country songbooks of the antebellum period.
"So-ho," said Legree to himself. "He thinks so, does he? How I hate these cursed Methodist hymns. Here, you nigger," said he, coming suddenly out upon Tom and raising his riding whip, "how dare you be getting up this yer row when you ought to be in bed? Shut your old black gash and get along with you."
"Yes, massa," said Tom with ready cheerfulness as he rose to go in. Legree was provoked beyond measure by Tom's evident happiness, and, riding up to him, belabored him over his head and shoulders.
"There, you dog," he said, "see if you'll feel so comfortable after that."
But the blows fell now only on the outer man, and not, as before, on the heart. Tom stood perfectly submissive, and yet Legree could not hide from himself that his power over his bond thrall was somehow gone. And, as Tom disappeared in his cabin, and he wheeled his horse suddenly round, there passed through his mind one of those vivid flashes that often send the lightning of conscience across the dark and wicked soul. He understood full well that it was God who was standing between him and his victim, and he blasphemed him. That submissive and silent man whom taunts, nor threats, nor stripes, nor cruelties could disturb, roused a voice within him, such as of old his master roused in the demoniac soul, saying, "What have we to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth? Art thou come to torment us before the time?" Tom's whole soul overflowed with compassion and sympathy for the poor wretches by whom he was surrounded. To him it seemed as if his life sorrows were now over, and as if, out of that strange treasury of peace and joy with which he had been endowed from above, he longed to pour out something for the relief of their woes. It is true, opportunities were scanty, but on the way to the fields and back again, and during the hours of labor, chances fell in his way of extending a helping hand to the weary, the disheartened and discouraged. The poor, worn-down, brutalized creatures at first could scarce comprehend this, but when it was continued week after week and month after month, it began to awaken long silent chords in their benumbed hearts. Gradually and imperceptibly the strange, silent, patient man, who was ready to bear everyone's burden, and sought help from none, who stood aside for all, and came last, and took least, yet was foremost to share his little all with any who needed, the man who, in cold nights, would give up his tattered blanket to add to the comfort of some woman who shivered with sickness, and who filled the baskets of the weaker ones in the field, at the terrible risk of coming short in his own measure, and who, though pursued with unrelenting cruelty by their common tyrant, never joined in uttering a word of reviling or cursing. This man, at last, began to have a strange power over them, and when the more pressing season was past, and they were allowed again their Sundays for their own use, many would gather together to hear from him of Jesus. They would gladly have met to hear and pray and sing in some place together, but Legree would not permit it, and more than once broke up such attempts with oaths and brutal execrations, so that the blessed news had to circulate from individual to individual. Yet who can speak the simple joy with which some of those poor outcasts, to whom life was a joyless journey to a dark unknown, heard of a compassionate Redeemer and a heavenly home? It is the statement of missionaries that, of all races of the earth, none have received the gospel with such eager docility as the African. The principle of reliance and unquestioning faith, which is its foundation, is more a native element in this race than any other, and it has often been found among them that a stray seed of truth, born on some breeze of accident into hearts the most ignorant, has sprung up into fruit, whose abundance has shamed that of higher and more skillful culture. The poor mulatto woman, whose simple faith had been well nigh crushed and overwhelmed by the avalanche of cruelty and wrong which had fallen upon her, felt her soul raised up by the hymns and passage of Holy Writ, which this lowly missionary breathed into her ear in intervals, as they were going to and returning from work, and even the half-crazed and wandering mind of Cassie was soothed and calmed by his simple and unobtrusive influences. Stung to madness and despair by the crushing agonies of a life, Cassie had often resolved in her soul an hour of retribution, when her hand should avenge on her oppressor all the injustice and cruelty to which she had been witness, or which she had in her own person suffered. One night, after all in Tom's cabin were sunk in sleep, he was suddenly aroused by seeing her face at the hole between the logs that served for a window. She made a silent gesture for him to come out. Tom came out the door. It was between 1 and 2 o'clock at night. Broad, calm, still moonlight. Tom remarked, as the light of the moon fell upon Cassie's large black eyes, that there was a wild and peculiar glare in them, unlike their wonted fixed despair. "Come here, Father Tom," she said, laying her small hand on his wrist, and drawing him forward with a force as if the hand were of steel. "Come here. I've news for you." "What, Miss Cassie?" said Tom anxiously. "Tom, wouldn't you like your liberty?" "I shall have it, missy, in God's time," said Tom. "Aye, but you may have it tonight," said Cassie with a flash of sudden energy. "Come on." Tom hesitated. "Come," she said, in a whisper, fixing her black eyes on him. "Come along."
He's asleep, sound. I put enough into his brandy to keep him so. I wish I'd had more. I shouldn't have wanted you. But come, the back door is unlocked. There's an axe there. I put it there. His room door is open. I'll show you the way. I'd have done it myself, only my arms are so weak. Come along."
"Not for 10,000 worlds, missy," said Tom firmly, stopping and holding her back as she was pressing forward.
"But think of all these poor creatures," said Cassie. "We might set them all free and go somewhere in the swamps and find an island and live by ourselves. I've heard of its being done. Any life is better than this."
"No," said Tom firmly. "No. Good never comes of wickedness. I'd sooner chop my right hand off."
"Then I shall do it," said Cassie, turning.
"Oh, Missy Cassie," said Tom, throwing himself before her, "for the dear Lord's sake that died for you, don't sell your precious soul to the devil that way. Nothing but evil will come of it. The Lord hasn't called us to wrath. We must suffer and wait his time."
"Wait," said Cassie. "Haven't I waited? Waited till my head is dizzy and my heart sick. What has he made me suffer? What has he made hundreds of poor creatures suffer? Isn't he wringing the life-blood out of you? I'm called on. They call me. His time's come, and I'll have his heart's blood."
"No, no, no," said Tom, holding her small hands, which were clenched with spasmodic violence. "No, ye poor lost soul, that ye mustn't do. The dear blessed Lord never shed no blood but his own, and that he poured out for us when we was enemies. Lord, help us to follow his steps and love our enemies."
"Love!" said Cassie, with a fierce glare. "Love such enemies? It isn't in flesh and blood."
"No, missy, it isn't," said Tom, looking up.
"But he gives it to us, and that's the victory. When we can love and pray over all and through all, the battle's past and the victory's come. Glory be to God." And with streaming eyes and choking voice the black man looked up to heaven. "And this, O Africa, latest called of nations, called to the crown of thorns, the scourge, the bloody sweat, the cross of agony, this is to be thy victory. By this shalt thou reign with Christ when his kingdom shall come on earth." The deep fervor of Tom's feelings, the softness of his voice, his tears, fell like dew on the wild, unsettled spirit of the poor woman. A softness gathered over the lurid fires of her eye. She looked down, and Tom could feel the relaxing muscles of her hands as she said, "Didn't I tell you that evil spirits followed me? Oh, Father Tom, I can't pray. I wish I could. I never have prayed since my children were sold. What you say must be right, I know it must, but when I try to pray, I can only hate and curse. I can't pray."
"Poor soul," said Tom compassionately. "Satan desires to have ye and sift ye as wheat. I pray the Lord for ye. Oh, Missy Casey, turn to the dear Lord Jesus. He came to bind up the broken-hearted and comfort all that mourn." Casey stood still, while large, heavy tears dropped from her downcast eyes. "Missy Casey," said Tom, in a hesitating voice, after surveying her in silence, "if you only could get away from here, if the thing was possible, I advise ye and Emmeline to do it. That is, if you could go without blood-guiltiness, not otherwise."
"Would you try it with us, Father Tom?"
"No," said Tom. "Time was when I would. But the Lord's given me a work among these here poor souls, and I'll stay with 'em and bear my cross with 'em till the end. It's different with you. It's a snare to you. It's more'n you can stand, and you'd better go if you can."
"I know no way but through the grave," said Casey. "There's no beast or bird but can find a home somewhere. Even the snakes and the alligators have their places to lie down and be quiet. But there's no place for us. Down in the darkest swamps their dogs will hunt us out and find us. Everybody and everything is against us. Even the very beasts side against us. And where shall we go?"
Tom stood silent. At length he said, "Him that saved Daniel in the den of lions, that saves the children in the fiery furnace, him that walked on the sea and bade the winds be still, he's alive yet, and I've faith to believe he can deliver you. Try it, and I'll pray with all my might for you." "But what strange law of mind is it that an idea long overlooked and trodden underfoot as a useless stone suddenly sparkles out in new light as a discovered diamond. Casey had often revolved for hours all possible or probable schemes of escape, and dismissed them all as hopeless and impracticable. But at this moment there flashed through her mind a plan, so simple and feasible in all its details as to awaken an instant hope.
"Father Tom, I'll try it," she said suddenly.
"Amen," said Tom. "The Lord help ye." End of chapter 38. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 39, The Stratagem. The way of the wicked is as darkness. He knoweth not at what he stumbleth. Proverbs 4:19. The garret of the house that Legree occupied, like most other garrets, was a great desolate space, dusty, hung with cobwebs, and littered with cast-off lumber. The opulent family that had inhabited the house in the days of its splendor had imported a great deal of splendid furniture, some of which they had taken away with them, while some remained standing desolate in moldering, unoccupied rooms, or stored away in this place. One or two immense packing boxes, in which this furniture was brought, stood against the sides of the garret. There was a small window there which let in, through its dingy, dusty panes, a scanty, uncertain light on the tall, high-backed chairs and dusty tables that had once seen better days. Altogether it was a weird and ghostly place, but ghostly as it was, it wanted not in legends among the superstitious negroes to increase its terrors. Some years before, a negro woman who had incurred Legree's displeasure was confined there for several weeks. What passed there we do not say. The negroes used to whisper darkly to each other, but it was known that the body of the unfortunate creature was one day taken down from there and buried, and after that it was said that oaths and cursings, and the sound of violent blows, used to ring through that old garret, and mingled with wailings and groans of despair. Once, when Legree chanced to overhear something of this kind, he flew into a violent passion, and swore that the next one that told stories about that garret should have an opportunity of knowing what was there, for he would chain them up there for a week. This hint was enough to repress talking, though of course it did not disturb the credit of the story in the least. Gradually the staircase that led to the garret, and even the passageway to the staircase, were avoided by every one in the house, from every one fearing to speak of it, and the legend was gradually falling into desuetude. It had suddenly occurred to Cassie to make use of the superstitious excitability which was so great in Legree for the purpose of her liberation and that of her fellow-sufferer. The sleeping-room of Cassie was directly under the garret. One day, without consulting Legree, she suddenly took it upon her, with some considerable ostentation, to change all the furniture and appurtenances of the room to one at some considerable distance. The under-servants who were called on to effect this movement were running and bustling about with great zeal and confusion when Legree returned from a ride.
"Hello, you, Cass," said Legree. "What's in the wind now?"
"Nothing, only I choose to have another room," said Cassie doggedly.
"And what for, pray?"
said Legree.
"I choose to," said Cassie.
"The devil you do! And what for?"
"I'd like to get some sleep now and then."
"Sleep? Well, what hinders your sleeping?"
"I could tell, I suppose, if you want to hear," said Cassie dryly.
"Speak out, you minx," said Legree.
"Oh, nothing. I suppose it wouldn't disturb you, only groans and people scuffing and rolling around on the bare floor half the night, from 12 to morning."
"People up garret?" said Legree uneasily, but forcing a laugh. "Who are they, Cassie?"
Cassie raised her sharp black eyes and looked in the face of Legree with an expression that went through his bones as she said,
"To be sure, Simon, who are they? I'd like to have you tell me. You don't know, I suppose."
With an oath, Legree struck at her with his riding-whip, but she glided to one side and passed through the door, and looking back, said,
"If you'll sleep in that room, you'll know all about it. Perhaps you'd better try it."
And then immediately she shut and locked the door. Legree blustered and swore, and threatened to break down the door, but apparently thought better of it, and walked uneasily into the sitting-room. Cassie perceived that her shaft had struck home, and from that hour, with the most exquisite address, she never ceased to continue the train of influences she had begun. In a knot-hole of the garret that had opened, she had inserted the neck of an old bottle, in such a manner that when there was the least wind, most doleful and lugubrious wailing sounds proceeded from it, which in a high wind increased to a perfect shriek, such as to credulous and superstitious ears might easily seem to be that of horror and despair. These sounds were, from time to time, heard by the servants, and revived in full force the memory of the old ghost legend. A superstitious creeping horror seemed to fill the house, and though no one dared to breathe it to Legree, he found himself encompassed by it, as by an atmosphere. No one is so thoroughly superstitious as the godless man. The Christian is composed by the belief of a wise, all-ruling Father, whose presence fills the void unknown with light and order. But to the man who has dethroned God, the spirit land is, indeed, in the words of the Hebrew poet, a land of darkness and the shadow of death, without any order, where the light is as darkness. Life and death to him are haunted grounds, filled with goblin forms of vague and shadowy dread. Legree had had the slumbering moral elements in him roused by his encounters with Tom, roused only to be resisted by the determinate force of evil, but still there was a thrill and commotion of the dark, inner world, produced by every word or prayer or hymn that reacted in superstitious dread. The influence of Cassie over him was of a strange and singular kind. He was her owner, her tyrant and tormentor. She was, as he knew, wholly and without any possibility of help or redress, in his hands. And yet, so it is that the most brutal man cannot live in constant association with a strong female influence and not be greatly controlled by it. When he first bought her, she was, as she said, a woman delicately bred, and then he crushed her, without scruple, beneath the foot of his brutality. But, as time and debasing influences and despair hardened womanhood within her, and waked the fires of fiercer passions, she had become in a measure his mistress, and he alternately tyrannized over and dreaded her. This influence had become more harassing and decided, since partial insanity had given a strange, weird, unsettled cast to all her words and language. A night or two after this, Legree was sitting in the old sitting-room by the side of a flickering wood fire that threw uncertain glances round the room. It was a stormy, windy night, such as raises whole squadrons of nondescript noises in rickety old houses. Windows were rattling, shutters flapping, and wind carousing, rumbling and tumbling down the chimney, and every once in a while puffing out smoke and ashes, as if a legion of spirits were coming after them. Legree had been casting up accounts and reading newspapers for some hours, while Cassie sat in the corner, sullenly looking into the fire. Legree laid down his paper, and seeing an old book lying on the table, which he had noticed Cassie reading, the first part of the evening, took it up and began to turn it over. It was one of those collections of stories of bloody murders, ghostly legends, and supernatural visitations, which, coarsely got up and illustrated, have a strange fascination for one who once begins to read them. Legree poohed and pished, but read, turning page after page, till finally, after reading some way, he threw down the book with an oath.
"You don't believe in ghosts, do you, Cass?" said he, taking the tongs and settling the fire. "I thought you'd more sense than to let noises scare you."
"No matter what I believe," said Cassie sullenly.
"Fellows used to try to frighten me with their yarns at sea," said Legree. "Never come it round me that way. I'm too tough for any such trash, tell you."
Cassie sat looking intensely at him in the shadow of the corner. There was that strange light in her eyes that always impressed Legree with uneasiness.
"Them noises was nothing but rats in the wind," said Legree. "Rats will make a devil of a noise. I used to hear 'em sometimes down in the hold of the ship. And wind, Lord's sake, you can make anything out of wind."
Cassie knew Legree was uneasy under her eyes, and therefore she made no answer, but sat fixing them on him with that strange unearthly expression as before.
"Come, speak out, woman. Don't you think so?" said Legree.
"Can rats walk downstairs and come walking through the entry and open a door when you've locked it and set a chair against it," said Cassie, "and come walking right up to your bed and put out their hand so?" Cassie kept her glittering eyes fixed on Legree as she spoke, and he stared at her like a man in the nightmare, till, when she finished by laying her hand icy cold on his, he sprung back with an oath.
"Woman, what do you mean? Nobody did."
"Oh, no, of course not. Did I say they did?" said Cassie with a smile of chilling derision.
"But have you really seen? Come, Cass, what is it now? Speak out."
"You may sleep there yourself," said Cassie, "if you want to know."
"Did it come from the garret, Cassie?"
"It? What?" said Cassie.
"Why, what you told of."
I didn't tell you anything," said Cassie with dogged sullenness. Legree walked up and down the room uneasily.
"I'll have this yar thing examined. I'll look into it this very night. I'll take my pistols."
"Do," said Cassie. "Sleep in that room. I'd like to see you doing it. Fire your pistols, do." Legree stamped his foot and swore violently. "Don't swear," said Cassie. "Nobody knows who may be hearing you. Hark! What was that?"
"What?"
said Legree, starting. A heavy old Dutch clock that stood in the corner of the room began and slowly struck 12. For some reason or other, Legree neither spoke nor moved. A vague horror fell on him, while Cassie, with a keen, sneering glint in her eyes, stood looking at him, counting the strokes.
12 o'clock. Well, now we'll see," said she,
turning and opening the door into the passageway and standing as if listening.
"Hark! What's that?"
said she, raising her finger.
"It's only the wind," said Legree. "Don't you hear how cursedly it blows?"
"Simon, come here,"
said Cassie in a whisper, laying her hand on his and leading him to the foot of the stairs.
"Do you know what that is? Hark!"
A wild shriek came pealing down the stairway. It came from the garret. Legree's knees knocked together. His face grew white with fear.
"Hadn't you better get your pistols?" said Cassie with a sneer that froze Legree's blood. "It's time this thing was looked into, you know. I'd like to have you go up now. There, at it."
"I won't go," said Legree with an oath.
"Why not? There ain't any such thing as ghosts, you know. Come," said Cassie, flitting up the winding stairway, laughing and looking back after him. "Come on."
"I believe you are the devil," said Legree. "Come back, you hag! Come back, Cass! You shan't go!"
But Cassie laughed wildly and fled on. He heard her open the entry doors that led to the garret. A wild gust of wind swept down, extinguishing the candle he held in his hand, and with it the fearful unearthly screams. They seemed to be shrieked in his very ear. Legree fled frantically into the parlor, whither in a few moments he was followed by Cassie, pale, calm, cold as an avenging spirit, and with that same fearful light in her eye.
"I hope you are satisfied," said she.
"Blast you, Cass!" said Legree.
"What for?" said Cassie. "I only went up and shut the doors. What's the matter with that garret, Simon, do you suppose?" said she.
"None of your business," said Legree.
"Oh, it ain't? Well," said Cassie, "at any rate, I'm glad I don't sleep under it."
Anticipating the rising of the wind that very evening, Cassie had been up and opened the garret window. Of course, the moment the doors were opened, the wind had drafted down and extinguished the light. This may serve as a specimen of the game that Cassie played with Legree until he would sooner have put his head into a lion's mouth than to have explored that garret. Meanwhile, in the night, when everybody else was asleep, Cassie slowly and carefully accumulated there a stock of provisions sufficient to afford subsistence for some time. She transferred, article by article, a greater part of her own and Emmeline's wardrobe. All things being arranged, they only waited a fitting opportunity to put their plan in execution. By cajoling Legree and taking advantage of a good-natured interval, Cassie had got him to take her with him to the neighboring town, which was situated directly on the Red River. With a memory sharpened to almost preternatural clearness, she remarked every turn in the road, and formed a mental estimate of the time to be occupied in traversing it. At the time when all was matured for action, our readers may, perhaps, like to look behind the scenes and see the final coup d'etat. It was now near evening. Legree had been absent on a ride to a neighboring farm. For many days Cassie had been unusually gracious and accommodating in her humors, and Legree and she had been, apparently, on the best of terms.
At present we may behold her and Emmeline in the room of the latter, busy in sorting and arranging two small bundles. "There, these will be large enough," said Cassie. "Now put on your bonnet and let's start. It's just about the right time." "Why, they can see us yet," said Emmeline. "I mean they shall," said Cassie coolly. "Don't you know that they must have their chase after us, at any rate? The way of the thing is to be just this: we will steal out of the back door and run down by the quarters. Sambo or Quimbo will be sure to see us. They will give chase, and we will get into the swamp. Then they can't follow us any further till they go up and give the alarm and turn out the dogs, and so on. And while they are blundering around and tumbling over each other, as they always do, you and I will slip along to the creek that runs back of the house and wade along in it till we get opposite the back door. That will put the dogs all at fault, for scent won't lie in the water. Every one will run out of the house to look after us, and then we'll whip in at the back door and up into the garret, where I've got a nice bed made up in one of the great boxes. We must stay in that garret a good while, for I tell you he will raise heaven and earth after us. He'll muster some of those old overseers on the other plantations, and have a great hunt, and they'll go over every inch of ground in that swamp. He makes it his boast that nobody ever got away from him, so let him hunt at his leisure." "Cassie, how well you have planned it," said Emmeline. "Who ever would have thought of it but you?" There was neither pleasure nor exultation in Cassie's eyes, only a despairing firmness. "Come," she said, reaching her hand to Emmeline. The two fugitives glided noiselessly from the house and flitted through the gathering shadows of evening along by the quarters. The crescent moon, set like a silver signet in the western sky, delayed a little the approach of night. As Cassie expected, when quite near the verge of the swamps that encircled the plantation, they heard a voice calling to them to stop. It was not Sambo, however, but Legree, who was pursuing them with violent execrations. At the sound, the feebler spirit of Emmeline gave way, and laying hold of Cassie's arm, she said, "Oh, Cassie, I'm going to faint." "If you do, I'll kill you," said Cassie, drawing a small glittering stiletto and flashing it before the eyes of the girl. The diversion accomplished the purpose. Emmeline did not faint, and succeeded in plunging, with Cassie, into a part of the labyrinth of swamp so deep and dark that it was perfectly hopeless for Legree to think of following them without assistance.
"Well," he said, chuckling brutally, "at any rate they've got themselves into a trap now, the baggage. They're safe enough. They shall sweat for it." "Hello there, Sambo! Quimbo! All hands!" called Legree, coming to the quarters, when the men and women were just returning from work. "There's 2 runaways in the swamps. I'll give $5 to any nigger as catches 'em. Turn out the dogs. Turn out Tiger and Fury and the rest."
The sensation produced by this news was immediate. Many of the men sprang forward officiously to offer their services, either from the hope of the reward or from that cringing subserviency which is one of the most baleful effects of slavery. Some ran one way, and some another. Some were for getting flambeaux of pine knots. Some were uncoupling the dogs, whose hoarse, savage bay added not a little to the animation of the scene.
"Massa, shall we shoot 'em if can't cotch 'em?"
said Sambo, to whom his master brought out a rifle.
"You may fire on Cass, if you like. It's time she was gone to the devil, where she belongs. But the gal, not," said Legree. "And now, boys, be spry and smart. $5 for him that gets 'em, and a glass of spirits to every one of you, anyhow." The whole band, with the glare of blazing torches, and whoop and shout and savage yell of man and beast, proceeded down to the swamp, followed at some distance by every servant in the house. The establishment was, of a consequence, wholly deserted, when Cassie and Emmeline glided into it the back way. The whooping and shouts of their pursuers were still filling the air, and looking from the sitting-room windows, Cassie and Emmeline could see the troop, with their flambeaux, just dispersing themselves along the edge of the swamp.
"See there," said Emmeline, pointing to Cassie. "The hunt has begun. Look how those lights dance about. Hark! The dogs! Don't you hear? If we were only there, our chances wouldn't be worth a picayune. Oh, for pity's sake, do let's hide ourselves quick."
"There's no occasion for hurry," said Cassie coolly. "They are all out after the hunt. That's the amusement of the evening. We'll go upstairs by and by. Meanwhile," said she, deliberately taking a key from the pocket of a coat that Legree had thrown down in his hurry, "meanwhile I shall take something to pay our passage." She unlocked the desk, took from it a roll of bills, which she counted over rapidly.
"Oh, don't let's do that," said Emmeline.
"Don't," said Cassie. "Why not?" Would you have us starve in the swamps, or have that will pay our way to the Free States? Money will do anything, girl." And as she spoke she put the money in her bosom. "It would be stealing," said Emmeline in a distressed whisper. "Stealing," said Cassie with a scornful laugh. "They who steal body and soul needn't talk to us. Every one of these bills is stolen. Stolen from poor, starving, sweating creatures who must go to the devil at last for his profit. Let him talk about stealing. But come, we may as well go up garret. I've got a stock of candles there, and some books to pass away the time. You may be pretty sure they won't come there to inquire after us. If they do, I'll play ghost for them." When Emmeline reached the garret she found an immense box in which some heavy pieces of furniture had once been brought, turned on its side, so that the opening faced the wall, or rather the eaves. Cassie lit a small lamp, and creeping round under the eaves they established themselves in it. It was spread with a couple of small mattresses and some pillows. A box near by was plentifully stored with candles, provisions, and all the clothing necessary to their journey, which Cassie had arranged into bundles of an astonishingly small compass. "There," said Cassie, as she fixed the lamp into a small hook, which she had driven into the side of the box for that purpose. "This is to be our home for the present. How do you like it?" "Are you sure they won't come and search the garret?" "I'd like to see Simon Legree doing that," said Cassie. "No, indeed, he will be too glad to keep away. As to the servants, they would any of them stand and be shot sooner than show their faces here." Somewhat reassured, Emmeline settled herself back on her pillow. "What did you mean, Cassie, by saying you would kill me?" she said simply. "I meant to stop your fainting," said Cassie, "and I did do it. And now I tell you, Emmeline, you must make up your mind not to faint, let what will come. There's no sort of need of it. If I had not stopped you, that wretch might have had his hands on you by now." Emmeline shuddered. The two remained some time in silence. Cassie busied herself with a French book. Emmeline, overcome with exhaustion, fell into a doze, and slept some time. She was awakened by loud shouts and outcries, the tramp of horses' feet, and the baying of dogs. She started up with a faint shriek. "Only the hunt coming back," said Cassie coolly. "Never fear. Look out at this knot-hole. Don't you see 'em all down there? Simon has to give up for this night. Look how muddy his horse is, flouncing about in the swamp. The dogs, too, look rather crestfallen. Ah, my good sir, you'll have to try the race again and again. The game isn't there." "Oh, don't speak a word," said Emmeline. "What if they should hear you?" "If they do hear anything, it will make them very particular to keep away," said Cassie. "No danger. We may make any noise we please, and it will only add to the effect." At length the stillness of midnight settled down over the house. Legree, cursing his ill luck and vowing dire vengeance on the morrow, went to bed. End of chapter 39. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 40. The Martyr. Deem not the just by heaven forgot, though life its common gifts deny, though with a crushed and bleeding heart, as spurned of man he goes to die. For God hath marked each sorrowing day, and numbered every bitter tear, and heaven's long years of bliss shall pay for all his children suffer here. Bryant. Note: this poem does not appear in the collected works of William Cullen Bryant, nor in the collected poems of his brother John Howard Bryant. It was probably copied from a newspaper or magazine. The longest way must have its close. The gloomiest night will wear on to a morning. An eternal, inexorable lapse of moments is ever hurrying the day of the evil to an eternal night, and the night of the just to an eternal day. We have walked with our humble friend thus far in the valley of slavery, first through flowery fields of ease and indulgence, then through heartbreaking separations from all that man holds dear. Again we have waited with him in a sunny island where generous hands concealed his chains with flowers, and lastly we have followed him
when the last ray of earthly hope went out in night, and seen how, in the blackness of earthly darkness, the firmament of the unseen has blazed with stars of new and significant luster. The morning star now stands over the tops of the mountains, and gales and breezes not of earth show that the gates of day are unclosing. The escape of Cassie and Emmeline irritated the before surly temper of Legree to the last degree, and his fury, as was to be expected, fell upon the defenseless head of Tom. When he hurriedly announced the tidings among his hands, there was a sudden light in Tom's eye, a sudden upraising of his hands, that did not escape him. He saw that he did not join the muster of the pursuers. He thought of forcing him to do it, but, having had of old experience of his inflexibility when commanded to take part in any deed of inhumanity, he would not in his hurry stop to enter into any conflict with him. Tom therefore remained behind, with a few who had learned of him to pray, and offered up prayers for the escape of the fugitives. When Legree returned, baffled and disappointed, all the long-working hatred of his soul towards his slave began to gather in a deadly and desperate form. Had not this man braved him, steadily, powerfully, resistlessly, ever since he bought him? Was there not a spirit in him which, silent as it was, burned on him like the fires of perdition?
"I hate him," said Legree that night as he sat up in his bed. "I hate him. And isn't he mine? Can't I do what I like with him? Who's to hinder, I wonder?"
And Legree clenched his fist and shook it, as if he had something in his hands that he could rend in pieces. But then Tom was a faithful, valuable servant, and although Legree hated him the more for that, yet the consideration was still somewhat of a restraint to him. The next morning he determined to say nothing, as yet, to assemble a party from some neighboring plantations, with dogs and guns, to surround the swamp, and go about the hunt systematically. If it succeeded, well and good. If not, he would summon Tom before him, and, his teeth clenched and his blood boiled, then he would break the fellow down. Or there was a dire inward whisper, to which his soul assented. Ye say that the interest of the master is a sufficient safeguard for the slave. In the fury of man's mad will, he will wittingly, and with open eye, sell his own soul to the devil to gain his ends. And will he be more careful of his neighbor's body? "Well," said Cassie the next day from the garret, as she reconnoitered through the knot-hole, "the hunt's going to begin again to-day." 3 or 4 mounted horsemen were curvetting about on the space in front of the house, and 1 or 2 leashes of strange dogs were struggling with the negroes who held them, baying and barking at each other. The men are, 2 of them, overseers of plantations in the vicinity, and others were some of Legree's associates at the tavern bar of a neighboring city, who had come for the interest of the sport. A more hard-favored set perhaps could not be imagined. Legree was serving brandy profusely round among them, as also among the negroes who had been detailed from the various plantations for this service; for it was an object to make every service of this kind among the negroes as much of a holiday as possible. Cassie placed her ear at the knot-hole, and, as the morning air blew directly towards the house, she could overhear a good deal of the conversation. A grave sneer overcast the dark, severe gravity of her face as she listened and heard them divide out the ground, discuss the rival merits of the dogs, give orders about firing, and the treatment of each in case of capture. Cassie drew back, and clasping her hands looked upward and said, "O great, almighty God, we are all sinners, but what have we done, more than all the rest of the world, that we should be treated so?" There was a terrible earnestness in her face and voice as she spoke. "If it wasn't for you, child," she said, looking at Emmeline, "I'd go out to them, and I'd thank any one of them that would shoot me down. For what use will freedom be to me? Can it give me back my children, or make me what I used to be?" Emmeline, in her childlike simplicity, was half afraid of the dark moods of Cassie. She looked perplexed, but made no answer. She only took her hand with a gentle caressing movement. "Don't," said Cassie, trying to draw it away. "You'll get me to loving you, and I never mean to love anything again." "Poor Cassie," said Emmeline, "don't feel so. If the Lord gives us liberty, perhaps he'll give you back your daughter. At any rate, I'll be like a daughter to you.
I know I'll never see my poor old mother again. I shall love you, Cassie, whether you love me or not." The gentle childlike spirit conquered. Cassie sat down by her, put her arm round her neck, stroked her soft brown hair, and Emmeline then wondered at the beauty of her magnificent eyes, now soft with tears. "Oh, Em," said Cassie, "I've hungered for my children, and thirsted for them, and my eyes fail with longing for them. Here, here," she said, striking her breast, "it's all desolate, all empty. If God would give me back my children, then I could pray." "You must trust him, Cassie," said Emmeline. "He is our Father." "His wrath is upon us," said Cassie. "He has turned away in anger." "No, Cassie, he will be good to us. Let us hope in him," said Emmeline. "I always have had hope." The hunt was long, animated, and thorough, but unsuccessful; and with grave, ironic exultation, Cassie looked down on Legree, as, weary and dispirited, he alighted from his horse.
"Now, Quimbo," said Legree, as he stretched himself down in the sitting-room, "you just go and walk that Tom up here right away. The old cuss is at the bottom of this yar whole matter, and I'll have it out of his old black hide, or I'll know the reason why."
Sambo and Quimbo, both, though hating each other, were joined in one mind by a no less cordial hatred of Tom. Legree had told them, at first, that he had bought him for a general overseer in his absence, and this had begun an ill will on their part, which had increased in their debased and servile natures as they saw him becoming obnoxious to their master's displeasure. Quimbo therefore departed with a will to execute his orders. Tom heard the message with a forewarning heart, for he knew all the plan of the fugitives' escape and the place of their present concealment. He knew the deadly character of the man he had to deal with, and his despotic power; but he felt strong in God to meet death rather than betray the helpless. He sat his basket down by the roe, and, looking up, said, "Into thy hands I commend my spirit. Thou hast redeemed me, O Lord God of truth," and then quietly yielded himself to the rough, brutal grasp with which Quimbo seized him.
"Aye, aye," said the giant as he dragged him along, "he'll cotch it now. I'll bound Massa's back's up high. No sneaking out now. Tell you, he'll get it, no mistake. See how you'll look now, helping Massa's niggers to run away. See what you'll get."
The savage words, none of them reached that ear. A higher voice there was saying, "Fear not them that kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do." Nerve and bone of that poor man's body vibrated to those words, as if touched by the finger of God, and he felt the strength of 1,000 souls in one. As he passed along, the trees and bushes, the huts of his servitude, the whole scene of his degradation, seemed to whirl by him as the landscape by the rushing ear. His soul throbbed, his home was in sight, and the hour of release seemed at hand.
"Well, Tom,"
said Legree, walking up and seizing him grimly by the collar of his coat, and speaking through his teeth in a paroxysm of determined rage,
"do you know I've made up my mind to kill you?"
"It's very likely, massa," said Tom calmly.
"I have," said Legree, with a grim and terrible calmness, "done just that thing, Tom, unless you tell me what you know about these Argylls."
Tom stood silent.
"D'ye hear?"
said Legree, stamping, with a roar like that of an incensed lion.
"Speak!" "I hain't got nothing to tell, massa," said Tom, with a slow, firm, deliberate utterance. "Do you dare to tell me, you old black Christian, you don't know?" said Legree.
Tom was silent.
"Speak!" thundered Legree, striking him furiously. "Do you know anything?"
"I know, massa, but I can't tell anything. I can die." Legree drew in a long breath, and, suppressing his rage, took Tom by the arm, and, approaching his face almost to his, said in a terrible voice,
"Hark ye, Tom, ye think 'cause I've let you off before, I don't mean what I say. But this time I've made up my mind, and counted the cost. You've always stood it out agin me. Now I'll conquer ye or kill ye, one or t'other. I'll count every drop of blood there is in you, and take 'em one by one, till ye give up."
Tom looked up to his master, and answered, "Massa, if you was sick or in trouble or dying, and I could save ye, I'd give ye my heart's blood.
and if taking every drop of blood in this poor old body would save your precious soul, I'd give 'em freely, as the Lord gave his for me. Oh, massa, don't bring this great sin on your soul. It will hurt you more than 'twill me. Do the worst you can. My troubles be over soon. But if you don't repent, yours won't never end." Like a strange snatch of heavenly music heard in the lull of a tempest, this burst of feeling made a moment's blank pause. Legree stood aghast, and looked at Tom, and there was such a silence that the tick of the old clock could be heard, measuring, with silent touch, the last moments of mercy and probation to that hardened heart. It was but a moment. There was one hesitating pause, one irresolute, relenting thrill, and the spirit of evil came back with sevenfold vehemence, and Legree, foaming with rage, smote his victim to the ground. Scenes of blood and cruelty are shocking to our ear and heart. What man has nerve to do, man has not nerve to hear. What brother man and brother Christian must suffer cannot be told us, even in our secret chamber, it so harrows the soul. And yet, O my country, these things are done under the shadow of thy laws. O Christ, thy church sees them almost in silence. But of old there was one whose suffering changed an instrument of torture, degradation, and shame into a symbol of glory, honor, and immortal life, and where his spirit is, neither degrading stripes, nor blood, nor insults, can make the Christian's last struggle less than glorious. Was he alone that long night whose brave, loving spirit was bearing up in that old shed against buffeting and brutal stripes? Nay, there stood by him one, seen by him alone, like unto the Son of God. The tempter stood by him too, blinded by furious despotic will, every moment pressing him to shun that agony by the betrayal of the innocent. But the brave, true heart was firm on the eternal rock. Like his Master, he knew that if he saved others, himself he could not save, nor could utmost extremity wring from him words save of prayers and holy trust.
"He's most gone, massa,"
said Sambo, touched in spite of himself by the patience of his victim.
"Pay away till he gives up. Give it to him. Give it to him," shouted Legree. "I'll take every drop of blood he has, unless he confesses."
Tom opened his eyes and looked upon his master. "Ye poor miserable critter," he said, "there ain't no more you can do. I forgive ye with all my soul," and he fainted entirely away.
"I believe, my soul, he's done for, finally," said Legree, stepping forward to look at him. "Yes, he is. Well, his mouth's shut up at last. That's one comfort."
"Yes, Legree, but who shall shut up that voice in thy soul, that soul past repentance, past prayer, past hope, in whom the fire that never shall be quenched is already burning?" Yet Tom was not quite gone. His wondrous words and pious prayers had struck upon the hearts of the imbruted blacks, who had been the instruments of cruelty upon him, and the instant Legree withdrew, they took him down, and in their ignorance sought to call him back to life, as if that were any favor to him.
"Sartain we's been doing a dreadful wicked thing," said Sambo. "Hopes masser'll have to count for it, not we."
They washed his wounds. They provided a rude bed of some refuse cotton for him to lie down on, and one of them, stealing up to the house, begged a drink of brandy of Legree, pretending that he was tired and wanted it for himself. He brought it back and poured it down Tom's throat.
"Oh, Tom," said Quimbo, "we's been awful wicked to you."
"I forgive ye with all my heart," said Tom faintly.
"Oh, Tom, do tell us who is Jesus, anyhow," said Sambo. "Jesus that's been a-standing by you so all this night, who is he?" The word roused the failing, fainting spirit. He poured forth a few energetic sentences of that wondrous one, his life, his death, his everlasting presence and power to save. They wept, both the two savage men. "Why didn't I never hear this before?" said Sambo.
But I do believe. I can't help it. Lord Jesus, have mercy on us."
"Poor critters," said Tom. "I'd be willing to bar all I have, if it'll only bring you to Christ. Oh, Lord, give me these 2 more souls, I pray."
That prayer was answered. End of chapter 40. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 41. The Young Master. 2 days after, a young man drove a light wagon up through the avenue of china trees, and, throwing the reins hastily on the horse's neck, sprang out and inquired for the owner of the place. It was George Shelby. And to show how he came to be there, we must go back in our story. The letter of Miss Ophelia to Mrs. Shelby had, by some unfortunate accident, been detained for a month or 2 at some remote post office before it reached its destination. And of course, before it was received, Tom was already lost to view among the distant swamps of the Red River. Mrs. Shelby read the intelligence with the deepest concern, but any immediate action upon it was an impossibility. She was then in attendance on the sick bed of her husband, who lay delirious in the crisis of a fever. Master George Shelby, who in the interval had changed from a boy to a tall young man, was her constant and faithful assistant, and her only reliance in superintending his father's affairs. Miss Ophelia had taken the precaution to send them the name of the lawyer who did business for the St. Clairs, and the most that in the emergency could be done was to address a letter of inquiry to him. The sudden death of Mr. Shelby a few days after brought, of course, an absorbing pressure of other interests for a season. Mr. Shelby showed his confidence in his wife's ability by appointing her sole executrix upon his estates, and thus immediately a large and complicated amount of business was brought upon her hands. Mrs. Shelby, with characteristic energy, applied herself to the work of straightening the entangled web of affairs, and she and George were for some time occupied with collecting and examining accounts, selling property, and settling debts; for Mrs. Shelby was determined that everything should be brought into tangible and recognizable shape, let the consequences to her prove what they might. In the meantime, they received a letter from the lawyer to whom Miss Ophelia had referred them, saying that he knew nothing of the matter, that the man was sold at a public auction, and that, beyond receiving the money, he knew nothing of the matter. Neither George nor Mrs. Shelby could be easy at this result, and accordingly, some 6 months later, the latter, having business for his mother down the river, resolved to visit New Orleans in person, and push his inquiries in hopes of discovering Tom's whereabouts and restoring him. After some months of unsuccessful search, by the merest accident George fell in with a man in New Orleans who happened to be possessed of the desired information, and with his money in his pocket, our hero took steamboat for Red River, resolving to find out and repurchase his old friend. He was soon introduced into the house, where he found Legree in the sitting-room. Legree received the stranger with a kind of surly hospitality. "I understand," said the young man, "that you bought in New Orleans a boy named Tom. He used to be on my father's place, and I came to see if I couldn't buy him back." Legree's brow grew dark, and he broke out passionately,
"Yes, I did buy such a fellow, and a hell of a bargain I had of it, too. The most rebellious, saucy, impudent dog. Set up my niggers to run away. Got off 2 gals, worth $800 or $1,000 apiece. He owned to that, and when I bid him tell me where they was, he up and said he knew, but he wouldn't tell, and stood to it, though I gave him the cussedest flogging I ever gave a nigger yet. I believe he's trying to die, but I don't know as he'll make it out."
"Where is he?" said George impetuously. "Let me see him." The cheeks of the young man were crimson and his eyes flashed fire, but he prudently said nothing as yet.
"He's in that our shed,"
said a little fellow who stood holding George's horse. Legree kicked the boy and swore at him, but George, without saying another word, turned and strode to the spot. Tom had been lying 2 days since the fatal night, not suffering, for every nerve of suffering was blunted and destroyed. He lay, for the most part, in a quiet stupor. for the laws of a powerful and well-knit frame would not at once release the imprisoned spirit. By stealth there had been there, in the darkness of the night, poor desolated creatures who stole from their scanty hour's rest, that they might repay to him some of those ministrations of love in which he had always been so abundant. Truly, those poor disciples had little to give, only the cup of cold water, but it was given with full hearts. Tears had fallen on that honest, insensible face, tears of late repentance in the poor, ignorant heathen whom his dying love and patience had awakened to repentance, and bitter prayers breathed over him to a late-found Saviour, of whom they scarce knew more than the name, but whom the yearning, ignorant heart of man never implores in vain. Cassie, who had glided out of her place of concealment, and by overhearing learned the sacrifice that had been made for her and Emmeline, had been there the night before, defying the danger of detection, and moved by the last few words which the affectionate soul had yet strength to breathe. The long winter of despair, the ice of years, had given way, and the dark despairing woman had wept and prayed. When George entered the shed he felt his head giddy and his heart sick.
"Is it possible? Is it possible?" said he, kneeling down by him. "Uncle Tom, my poor, poor old friend!"
Something in the voice penetrated to the ear of the dying. He moved his head gently, smiled, and said,
"Jesus can make a dying bed feel soft as down pillows are."
Tears which did honor to his manly heart fell from the young man's eyes as he bent over his poor friend.
"Oh, dear Uncle Tom, do wake, do speak once more. Look up. Here's Massa George, your own little Massa George. Don't you know me?"
"Massa George,"
said Tom, opening his eyes and speaking in a feeble voice.
"Massa George."
He looked bewildered. Slowly the idea seemed to fill his soul, and the vacant eye became fixed and brightened. The whole face lighted up, the hard hands clasped, and tears ran down the cheeks.
"Bless the Lord, it is, it is. It's all I wanted. They haven't forgot me. It warms my soul. It does my heart good. Now I shall die content. Bless the Lord on my soul."
"You shan't die. You mustn't die, nor think of it. I've come to buy you and take you home," said George with impetuous vehemence.
"Oh, Massa George, you're too late. The Lord's bought me, and is going to take me home, and I long to go. Heaven is better than Kentuck."
"Oh, don't die. It'll kill me. It'll break my heart to think what you've suffered, and lying in this old shed here. Poor, poor fellow."
"Don't call me poor fellow," said Tom solemnly. "I have been poor fellow, but that's all past and gone now. I'm right in the door, going into glory. Oh, Massa George, heaven has come. I've got the glory. The Lord Jesus has given it to me. Glory be to his name."
George was awestruck at the force, the vehemence, the power with which these broken sentences were uttered. He sat gazing in silence. Tom grasped his hand and continued,
"Ye mustn't now tell Chloe, poor soul, how ye found me. 'Twould be so drefful to her. Only tell her you found me going into glory, and that I couldn't stay for no one. And tell her the Lord stood by me everywhere and allus, and made everything light and easy. And, oh, the poor children and the baby. My old heart's been most broke for them time and again. Tell 'em all to follow me. Follow me. Give my love to Massa, and dear good Missis, and everybody in the place. You don't know. 'Pears like I loves 'em all. I loves every creature everywhere. It's nothing but love. Oh, Massa George, what a thing 'tis to be a Christian."
At this moment Legree sauntered up to the door of the shed, looked in with a dogged air of affected carelessness, and turned away.
"The old Satan," said George in his indignation. "It's a comfort to think the devil will pay him for this some of these days."
"Oh, don't. Oh, ye mustn't," said Tom, grasping his hand. "He's a poor miserable critter. It's awful to think on it. Oh,
If he only could repent, the Lord would forgive him now, but I'm afeard he never will."
"I hope he won't," said George. "I never want to see him in heaven."
"Hush, Massa George. It worries me. Don't feel so. He ain't done me no real harm, only opened the gate of the kingdom for me, that's all."
At this moment the sudden flush of strength which the joy of meeting his young master had infused into the dying man gave way. A sudden sinking fell upon him. He closed his eyes, and that mysterious and sublime change passed over his face that told the approach of other worlds. He began to draw his breath with long, deep inspirations, and his broad chest rose and fell heavily. The expression of his face was that of a conqueror.
Who shall separate us from the love of Christ?" he said,
in a voice that contended with mortal weakness, and with a smile he fell asleep. George sat fixed with solemn awe. It seemed to him that the place was holy, and as he closed the lifeless eyes and rose up from the dead, only one thought possessed him, that expressed by his simple old friend: "What a thing it is to be a Christian." He turned. Legree was standing sullenly behind him. Something in that dying scene had checked the natural fierceness of youthful passion. The presence of the man was simply loathsome to George, and he felt only an impulse to get away from him, with as few words as possible. Fixing his keen dark eyes on Legree, he simply said, pointing to the dead, "You have got all you ever can of him. What shall I pay you for the body? I will take it away and bury it decently."
"I don't sell dead niggers," said Legree doggedly. "You are welcome to bury him where and when you like."
"Boys," said George in an authoritative tone to two or three negroes who were looking at the body, "help me lift him up and carry him to my wagon, and get me a spade." One of them ran for a spade, the other two assisted George to carry the body to the wagon. George neither spoke to nor looked at Legree, who did not countermand his orders, but stood whistling with an air of forced unconcern. He sulkily followed them to where the wagon stood at the door. George spread his cloak in the wagon, and had the body carefully disposed of in it, moving the seat so as to give it room. Then he turned, fixed his eyes on Legree, and said with forced composure: "I have not, as yet, said to you what I think of this most atrocious affair. This is not the time and place. But, sir, this innocent blood shall have justice. I will proclaim this murder. I will go to the very first magistrate and expose you."
"Do,"
said Legree, snapping his fingers scornfully.
"I'd like to see you doing it. Where are you going to get witnesses? How are you going to prove it? Come, now."
George saw at once the force of this defiance. There was not a white person on the place, and in all Southern courts the testimony of colored blood is nothing. He felt at that moment as if he could have rent the heavens with his heart's indignant cry for justice, but in vain.
"After all, what a fuss for a dead nigger,"
said Legree. The word was as a spark to a powder magazine. Prudence was never a cardinal virtue of the Kentucky boy. George turned, and with one indignant blow knocked Legree flat upon his face, and as he stood over him, blazing with wrath and defiance, he would have formed no bad personification of his great namesake triumphing over the dragon. Some men, however, are decidedly bettered by being knocked down. If a man lays them fairly flat in the dust, they seem immediately to conceive a respect for him, and Legree was one of this sort. As he rose, therefore, and brushed the dust from his clothes, he eyed the slowly retreating wagon with some evident consideration, nor did he open his mouth till it was out of sight. Beyond the boundaries of the plantation, George had noticed a dry, sandy knoll shaded by a few trees. There they made the grave.
"Shall we take off the cloak, massa?"
said the negroes when the grave was ready. "No, no, bury it with him. It's all I can give you now, poor Tom, and you shall have it." They laid him in it, and the men shoveled away silently. They banked it up and laid green turf over it. "You may go, boys," said George, slipping a quarter into the hand of each. They lingered about, however.
"If young massa would please buy us," said one. We'd serve him so faithful," said the other. "Hard times here, massa," said the first. "Do, massa, buy us, please."
"I can't. I can't," said George with difficulty, motioning them off. "It's impossible." The poor fellows looked dejected and walked off in silence. "Witness, eternal God," said George, kneeling on the grave of his poor friend, "oh, witness that from this hour I will do what one man can to drive out this curse of slavery from my land." There is no monument to mark the last resting place of our friend. He needs none. His Lord knows where he lies, and will raise him up, immortal, to appear with him when he shall appear in his glory. Pity him not. Such a life and death is not for pity. Not in the riches of omnipotence is the chief glory of God, but in self-denying, suffering love. And blessed are the men whom he calls to fellowship with him, bearing their cross after him with patience. Of such it is written, "Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted." End of chapter 41. LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 42. An Authentic Ghost Story. For some remarkable reason, ghostly legends were uncommonly rife about this time among the servants on Legree's place. It was whisperingly asserted that footsteps, in the dead of night, had been heard descending the garret stairs and patrolling the house. In vain the doors of the upper entry had been locked. The ghost either carried a duplicate key in its pocket or availed itself of a ghost's immemorial privilege of coming through the keyhole, and promenaded as before, with a freedom that was alarming. Authorities were somewhat divided as to the outward form of the spirit, owing to a custom quite prevalent among negroes, and, for aught we know, among whites too, of invariably shutting the eyes and covering up heads under blankets, petticoats, or whatever else might come in use for a shelter on these occasions. Of course, as everybody knows, when the bodily eyes are thus out of the lists, the spiritual eyes are uncommonly vivacious and perspicuous, and therefore there were abundance of full-length portraits of the ghost, abundantly sworn and testified to, which, as if often the case with portraits, agreed with each other in no particular, except the common family peculiarity of the ghost tribe, the wearing of a white sheet. The poor souls were not versed in ancient history, and did not know that Shakespeare had authenticated this costume by telling how "the sheeted dead did squeak and gibber in the streets of Rome." Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 1, lines 115-116. And, therefore, their all hitting upon this is a striking fact in pneumatology, which we recommend to the attention of spiritual media generally. Be it as it may, we have private reasons for knowing that a tall figure in a white sheet did walk, at the most approved ghostly hours, around the Legree premises, pass out the doors, glide about the house, disappear at intervals, and, reappearing, pass up the silent stairway into that fatal garret, and that in the morning the entry doors were all found shut and locked as firm as ever. Legree could not help overhearing this whispering, and it was all the more exciting to him from the pains that were taken to conceal it from him. He drank more brandy than usual, held up his head briskly, and swore louder than ever in the daytime. But he had bad dreams, and the visions of his head on his bed were anything but agreeable. The night after Tom's body had been carried away, he rode to the next town for a carouse, and had a high one, got home late and tired, locked his door, took out the key, and went to bed. After all, let a man take what pains he may to hush it down, a human soul is an awful, ghostly, unquiet possession for a bad man to have. Who knows the metes and bounds of it? Who knows all its awful perhapses, those shudderings and tremblings, which it can no more live down than it can outlive its own eternity? What a fool is he who locks his door to keep out spirits, who has in his own bosom a spirit he dares not meet alone, whose voice, smothered far down and piled over with mountains of earthliness, is yet like the forewarning trumpet of doom. But Legree locked his door and set a chair against it. He set a night lamp at the head of his bed, and put his pistols there. He examined the catches and fastenings of the windows, and then swore he "didn't care for the devil and all his angels," and went to sleep. Well, he slept, for he was tired, slept soundly. But finally there came over his sleep a shadow, a horror, an apprehension of something dreadful hanging over him. It was his mother's shroud, he thought, but Cassie had it, holding it up and showing it to him. He heard a confused noise of screams and groanings, and with it all he knew he was asleep, and he struggled to wake himself. He was half awake. He was sure something was coming into his room. He knew the door was opening, but he could not stir hand or foot. At last he turned with a start. The door was open, and he saw a hand putting out his light. It was a cloudy, misty moonlight, and there he saw it, something white gliding in. He heard the still rustle of its ghostly garments. It stood still by his bed. A cold hand touched his. A voice said 3 times, in low, fearful whispers, "Come, come, come." And while he lay sweating with terror, he knew not when or how, the thing was gone. He sprang out of bed and pulled at the door. It was shut and locked, and the man fell down in a swoon. After this, Legree became a harder drinker than ever before. He no longer drank cautiously, prudently, but imprudently and recklessly. There were reports around the country, soon after, that he was sick and dying. Excess had brought on that frightful disease that seems to throw the lurid shadows of a coming retribution back into the present life. None could bear the horrors of that sick room, when he raved and screamed, and spoke of sights which almost stopped the blood of those who heard him, and at his dying bed stood a stern, white, inexorable figure, saying, "Come, come, come." By a singular coincidence, on the very night that this vision appeared to Legree, the house door was found open in the morning, and some of the negroes had seen 2 white figures gliding down the avenue towards the high road. It was near sunrise when Cassie and Emmeline paused, for a moment, in a little knot of trees near the town. Cassie was dressed after the manner of the Creole Spanish ladies, wholly in black. A small black bonnet on her head, covered by a veil thick with embroidery, concealed her face. It had been agreed that, in their escape, she was to personate the character of a Creole lady, and Emmeline that of her servant. Brought up from early life in connection with the highest society, the language, movements, and air of Cassie were all in agreement with this idea, and she had still enough remaining with her of a once splendid wardrobe, and sets of jewels, to enable her to personate the thing to advantage. She stopped in the outskirts of the town, where she had noticed trunks for sale, and purchased a handsome one. This she requested the man to send along with her; and accordingly, thus escorted by a boy wheeling her trunk, and Emmeline behind her, carrying her carpet-bag and sundry bundles, she made her appearance at the small tavern, like a lady of consideration. The first person that struck her after her arrival was George Shelby, who was staying there, awaiting the next boat. Cassie had remarked the young man from her loophole in the garret, and seen him bear away the body of Tom, and observed with secret exultation his rencontre with Legree. Subsequently she had gathered, from the conversations she had overheard among the negroes, as she glided about in her ghostly disguise after nightfall, who he was, and in what relation he stood to Tom. She therefore felt an immediate accession of confidence when she found that he was, like herself, awaiting the next boat. Cassie's air and manner, address, and evident command of money prevented any rising disposition to suspicion in the hotel. People never inquire too closely into those who are fair on the main point of paying well, a thing which Cassie had foreseen when she provided herself with money. In the edge of the evening a boat was heard coming along, and George Shelby handed Cassie aboard with the politeness which comes naturally to every Kentuckian, and exerted himself to provide her with a good stateroom. Cassie kept her room and bed on pretext of illness during the whole time they were on Red River, and was waited on with obsequious devotion by her attendant. When they arrived at the Mississippi River, George, having learned that the course of the strange lady was upward, like his own, proposed to take a stateroom for her on the same boat with himself, good-naturedly compassionating her feeble health and desirous to do what he could to assist her. Behold, therefore, the whole party safely transferred to the good steamer Cincinnati, and sweeping up the river under a powerful head of steam. Cassie's health was much better. She sat upon the guards, came to the table, and was remarked upon in the boat as a lady that must have been very handsome. From the moment that George got the first glimpse of her face, he was troubled with one of those fleeting and indefinite likenesses which almost everybody can remember and has been at times perplexed with. He could not keep himself from looking at her and watching her perpetually. At table, or sitting at her stateroom door, still she would encounter the young man's eyes fixed on her, and politely withdrawn when she showed by her countenance that she was sensible to the observation. Cassie became uneasy. She began to think that he suspected something, and finally resolved to throw herself entirely on his generosity, and entrusted him with her whole history. George was heartily disposed to sympathize with anyone who had escaped from Legree's plantation, a place that he could not remember or speak of with patience, and, with the courageous disregard of consequences which is characteristic of his age and state, he assured her that he would do all in his power to protect and bring them through. The next stateroom to Cassie's was occupied by a French lady named Dethau, who was accompanied by a fine little daughter, a child of some 12 summers. This lady, having gathered from George's conversation that he was from Kentucky, seemed evidently disposed to cultivate his acquaintance, in which design she was seconded by the graces of her little girl, who was about as pretty a plaything as ever diverted the weariness of a fortnight's trip on a steamboat. George's chair was often placed at her stateroom door, and Cassie, as she sat upon the guards, could hear their conversation. Madame Dethau was very minute in her inquiries as to Kentucky, where she said she had resided in a former period of her life. George discovered to his surprise that her former residence must have been in his own vicinity, and her inquiries showed a knowledge of people and things in his vicinity that was perfectly surprising to him.
"Do you know," said Madame Dethau to him one day, "of any man in your neighborhood of the name of Harris?"
"There is an old fellow of that name lives not far from my father's place," said George. "We never have had much intercourse with him, though."
"He is a large slave owner, I believe," said Madame Dethau, with a manner which seemed to betray more interest than she was exactly willing to show.
"He is," said George, looking rather surprised at her manner.
"Did you ever know of his having perhaps you may have heard of his having a mulatto boy named George?"
"Oh, certainly. George Harris. I know him well. He married a servant of my mother's, but has escaped now to Canada."
"He has?" said Madame Dethau, quickly. "Thank God!"
George looked a surprised inquiry, but said nothing. Madame Dethau leaned her head on her hand and burst into tears.
"He is my brother," she said.
"Madame!" said George, with a strong accent of surprise.
"Yes," said Madame Dethau, lifting her head proudly and wiping her tears. "Mr. Shelby, George Harris is my brother."
"I am perfectly astonished," said George, pushing back his chair a pace or two, and looking at Madame Dethau.
"I was sold to the South when he was a boy," said she. "I was bought by a good and generous man. He took me with him to the West Indies, set me free, and married me. It is but lately that he died, and I was going up to Kentucky to see if I could find and redeem my brother."
"I heard him speak of a sister Emily that was sold South," said George.
"Yes, indeed, I am the one," said Madame Dethau. "Tell me what sort of a—"
"A very fine young man," said George. Notwithstanding the curse of slavery that lay on him, he sustained a first-rate character, both for intelligence and principle. "I know, you see," he said, "because he married in our family."
"What sort of a girl?" said Madame Dethau, eagerly.
"A treasure," said George. "A beautiful, intelligent, amiable girl, very pious. My mother had brought her up, and trained her as carefully, almost, as a daughter. She could read and write, embroider and sew beautifully, and was a beautiful singer."
"Was she born in your house?" said Madame Dethau.
"No. Father bought her once in one of his trips to New Orleans, and brought her up as a present to mother. She was about 8 or 9 years old then. Father would never tell mother what he gave for her, but the other day, in looking over his old papers, we came across the bill of sale. He paid an extravagant sum for her, to be sure, I suppose on account of her extraordinary beauty." George sat with his back to Cassie, and did not see the absorbed expression of her countenance as he was giving these details. At this point in the story she touched his arm, and with a face perfectly white with interest, said,
"Do you know the names of the people he bought her of?"
"A man of the name of Simmons, I think, was the principal in the transaction. At least I think that was the name on the bill of sale."
"Oh, my God!"
said Cassie, and fell insensible on the floor of the cabin. George was wide awake now, and so was Madame de Thou, though neither of them could conjecture what was the cause of Cassie's fainting. Still they made all the tumult which is proper in such cases, George upsetting a wash pitcher and breaking 2 tumblers, in the warmth of his humanity, and various ladies in the cabin, hearing that somebody had fainted, crowded the stateroom door and kept out all the air they possibly could, so that on the whole everything was done that could be expected. Poor Cassie, when she recovered, turned her face to the wall and wept and sobbed like a child. Perhaps, mother, you can tell what she was thinking of. Perhaps you cannot. But she felt as sure in that hour that God had had mercy on her, and that she should see her daughter, as she did months afterwards, when but we anticipate. End of chapter 42.